The Senate chamber was alive with tension, every camera lens trained on the exchange unfolding before the nation. Polished desks reflected the harsh white light, aides scribbled frantically, and the faint hum of whispered conversations filled the air. Then, cutting through the gravity of the moment, came a sound that snapped heads and widened eyes. A laugh. It was Tommy Tuberville. The senator leaned back in his chair, lips curled in a smirk, shaking his head with the kind of dismissive chuckle reserved not for debate but for mockery. His laughter echoed against the marble walls, bouncing across the chamber, carrying a tone of arrogance that demanded attention. It wasn't humor, it was dismissal. And across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, composed, steady, unflinching, her dark eyes locked on him with the sharpness of someone who had weathered storms far more violent than ridicule. Viewers at home could feel the sting of that laugh. It wasn't just directed at her, it was aimed at anyone who had ever been talked over, laughed at, or belittled for daring to speak truth to power. The camera angles told the story. Tuberville basking in his smug performance, Crockett holding the silence like a weapon. Reporters in the press gallery tweeted furiously, their feeds exploding with real-time outrage. Clips of the laugh were clipped, subtitled, and spread within seconds, fueling a firestorm that no one in that room yet realized had been lit. For the millions watching, this was more than political theater. It was a test of dignity. Tuberville's chuckle was a reminder of every time arrogance tried to drown out sacrifice, every moment when entitlement mocked endurance. The room shifted, the air thickened. Something was coming, and the laughter only sharpened the edge of anticipation, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to play games. She wasn't there to trade insults. She carried more than a microphone, more than a prepared statement. Behind her calm exterior was a weight, a story, a piece of living history folded neatly in her hands. The laugh echoed across the chamber, but no one could predict the letter that would soon leave the senator speechless. But this was no ordinary debate, because Jasmine Crockett had been carrying something far heavier than words. The chamber was supposed to be deliberating on something sacred, America's promise to those who had worn the uniform. The debate centered on veterans' rights, funding, for mental health care, and the kind of long-term support that determines whether sacrifice is remembered with honor or abandoned in neglect. These weren't abstract policy notes on a piece of paper. They were lifelines for men and women who had faced the unimaginable and come home carrying scars that most of us cannot see. Yet, in that moment, Tommy Tuberville's laugh reduced it all to theater. To him, it seemed less a solemn discussion than an arena where he could roll his eyes, lean back, and dismiss his colleague with a chuckle. That sound was more than arrogance, it was erasure, because when he laughed at Jasmine Crockett, he wasn't just laughing at her words. He was mocking the weight behind them, the stories that tethered her to the very people this debate was supposed to serve. For millions of families watching at home, that chuckle carried venom. Mothers who had folded flags at military funerals. Children who grew up staring at faded photographs of fathers and mothers who never came home. Veterans who still wake up in the middle of the night, replaying firefights in their dreams. To them, Tuberville's smirk was a reminder of how easily the powerful can treat sacrifice like a punchline. It was a slap that echoed beyond the chamber, into kitchens, living rooms, and community halls across the country. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She knew something that Tuberville did not. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was resolve. Behind her stillness, she carried the legacy of a man who had lived through the very struggles being debated that day. Her father, a soldier who had served in Vietnam, had once written words on fragile paper that captured the cost of sacrifice with a clarity no speech could match. Those words, sealed in time, still burned in her memory. And so, while Tuberville chuckled, Crockett's silence began to grow heavier. Viewers didn't yet understand why her composure felt so different, so deliberate, as if she was holding back a storm. Every dismissive laugh only dug the senator deeper into a pit he couldn't see forming beneath his feet. Because Crockett wasn't waiting to strike with clever rhetoric, she was waiting to unveil something far more devastating. This was not about scoring political points. It was about reclaiming dignity for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Tuberville's mockery was not just an insult to Crockett. It was an insult to her father, to veterans across America, and to the very idea that service deserves. Respect, not ridicule. The contrast could not have been sharper. A senator laughing, and a daughter of a veteran holding a letter that could silence every smirk in the room. The tension thickened, and the audience at home leaned closer, sensing something they couldn't yet name. They saw the disdain etched across Tuberville's face, but they also saw the fire quietly building behind Crockett's eyes. They could not know, not yet, that history itself was waiting inside an envelope that had traveled decades to arrive. At this very moment, the room thought they were watching a routine sparring match. They had no idea history was about to walk in through a folded letter. To understand the weight of that laugh, one has to understand the man behind it. Tommy Tuberville did not emerge from the crucible of public service or a lifetime of civic duty. His rise came from stadium lights and Friday night headlines. For years, he was a football coach, celebrated in locker rooms and sports pages, a figure of bravado whose greatest battles were waged on turf and measured in touchdowns. He wore the image of the self-made man, the outsider who could stride from the sidelines into the halls of power as though politics were just another game. That outsider image became his political calling card. In a climate hungry for disruption, Tuberville promised to shake things up, to reject the so-called elites, to bring blunt talk and swagger to the Senate. And in 2020, Alabama voters sent him to Washington, convinced that a coach could coach the country's future. But the locker room style that may have motivated players translated poorly into governance. In Washington, Tuberville quickly became infamous for gaffes that bordered on absurdity. He mixed up 3 branches of government in interviews. He stumbled through basic policy questions. He treated Senate procedure like a playbook he hadn't bothered to study. Reporters began cataloging his missteps with disbelief, late-night comedians sharpening their monologues at his expense. Yet, for all the mockery he received, Tuberville responded with the same dismissive grin he wore on the football field. To him, mistakes didn't matter. Swagger did. He wielded confidence as a shield, brushing off critics and mocking those who... The irony was sharp. Tuberville had built his political image on supporting the troops, yet here he was laughing at a woman whose father had bled in uniform for the very freedoms that allowed him to sit in that chamber. He had claimed to honor sacrifice, but when sacrifice stood in front of him, embodied in Crockett's story, he smirked. The contradiction was no longer subtle. It was glaring. For many in that chamber, his laugh was just another display of arrogance. But for Crockett, it was a trigger. She had faced dismissive grins before. She had watched men underestimate her, wave her off, and try to drown her voice with mockery. What Tuberville didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every time he laughed, he brought her closer to revealing the one thing that could pierce through arrogance like glass. Because Crockett wasn't just another opponent. She was a daughter carrying the words of a father who had seen the fog of war, who had written by candlelight in jungles halfway around the world, whose letter held truths that no smirk could erase. Tuberville believed laughter was power, but power without substance is brittle, and brittle power always breaks when it collides with something unshakable, and Jasmine Crockett was unshakable, but every mocking laugh has a breaking point, and Crockett was about to find it. To understand why Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch when Tommy Tuberville laughed, you have to travel back long before the chamber lights, before the microphones, before the cameras ever found her face. Crockett's story began in the humblest of places, where the margins of society often pressed in tight, and where resilience was not a choice but a necessity. She grew up in a working-class household that taught her the quiet dignity of hard work and the louder dignity of never backing down. For young Jasmine, the world was not built to make space for her voice. But she learned early that her voice mattered, and that if she didn't use it, someone else would try to use theirs to silence her. Education was her weapon of choice. While others dismissed her dreams, she pursued them with relentlessness. Long nights of study, juggling part-time jobs, and shouldering the doubts of those who couldn't see beyond stereotypes. When the obstacles mounted, she pressed harder. Her determination carried her to law school, where she quickly gained a reputation not for arrogance, but for an unyielding empathy. She wasn't the student who spoke the loudest. She was the one who listened the deepest, who sought to understand the struggles of people society overlooked. Law became more than a career. It became a calling. She chose cases that others avoided, representing clients who had nowhere else to turn. Her courtroom presence wasn't theatrical, but it was undeniable. She fought with precision, with fire tempered by compassion. Every victory wasn't just hers. It was a lifeline for the community she served. That path, paved with grit and selflessness, eventually led her into politics. When Jasmine Crockett entered Congress, she didn't come with corporate backers or old family wealth. She came with the weight of lived experience, with a reputation for fighting on behalf of those whose stories rarely reach the chamber floor. She carried the struggles of immigrants, workers, veterans, and everyday families who believed dignity was not a privilege, but a right. And at the center of her values stood one man, her father. Her father had been a soldier in Vietnam, a young man who carried the hopes of his family and the burdens of a divided nation into a war zone, thousands of miles from home. The jungles he walked, the battles he endured, left imprints that could never be erased. He returned not to parades and gratitude, but to a country that often turned its back on its veterans, particularly those who came home with brown skin. Jasmine grew up watching him wrestle with those scars, not just the physical ones, but the invisible weight of memories that followed him like shadows. Yet, through it all, he carried himself with dignity. He worked, he provided, he stood tall even when the world gave him every reason to bow, and sometimes, late at night, he would reach for an old box. Inside were letters he had written during his service, letters filled with the young soldiers, fears, hopes, and defiance. To Jasmine, those letters were sacred. They were proof that her father had carried more courage in his youth than some politicians carried in their entire lives. They were reminders that sacrifice was not an abstract talking point. It was flesh and blood, written in ink, folded into envelopes stained by time. She didn't need to carry those letters to remember her father's strength, but she did, not always in her hands, but always in her heart. They became her compass, guiding her when debates turned ugly, when opponents grew arrogant, when laughter tried to drown her voice. Each letter reminded her that she came from a lineage of fighters, not in stadiums, not in televised sound bites, but in real battles where life and death hung in the balance. So when Tuberville laughed, Crockett didn't feel the urge to shout back or match his smugness with anger. She had learned from her father that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. And sometimes it strikes with truth so undeniable that arrogance crumbles under its weight. Her journey, from humble beginnings to law school, from defending the voiceless in courtrooms to standing tall in Congress, wasn't about ambition alone. It was about service. Every step was tied to a belief that no one should be erased, no one should be dismissed, no one should be laughed at for daring to demand justice. In Crockett's presence, you see the layers: the determined daughter, the disciplined lawyer, the unflinching representative, and above all, the child of a man who had faced war with courage and come home determined to raise his family with dignity. That legacy wasn't visible in Tuberville's smirk, but it was alive in her silence. What Tuberville didn't know was that Crockett had grown up in the shadow of a man who had already faced real battlefields. The exchange should have ended with Tuberville's first laugh, but arrogance has a way of demanding an encore. Instead of pulling back, the senator leaned further into his performance. Every time Jasmine Crockett pressed a point about veterans waiting months for medical care, about families struggling to access basic services, Tuberville leaned back, smirked, and let out another dismissive chuckle. It was the kind of laugh designed not to respond, but to belittle, as if serious arguments could be reduced to punchlines. The sound carried differently this time. The chamber, normally filled with the monotone rhythm of debate, seemed to shift. With every smirk, aides glanced at one another, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Senators shuffled in their seats, some leaning forward, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Because Crockett wasn't about to answer Tuberville with clever rhetoric or rehearsed line, she carried something deeper than debate, something that had been waiting, folded in paper for decades. And then, in a voice that carried the weight of generations, Crockett reached for the letter. The chamber held its breath. For a moment, the mocking laughter that had filled the air just seconds earlier evaporated, leaving behind a quiet so deep it felt almost unnatural. All eyes turned toward Jasmine Crockett as her hand lingered over the folder. The cameras zoomed closer, journalists poised mid-keystroke, and then, with deliberate care, she pulled out a single sheet of paper, creased, yellowed with time, but still intact. "This," she began, her voice steady, "was written by my father, Sergeant James Crockett, while he served in Vietnam." Her words fell like a stone into still water, rippling outward. The effect was immediate. The grin on Tommy Tuberville's face faltered, confusion replacing confidence. He leaned forward slightly, as though realizing too late that something far beyond his control had entered the chamber. Crockett held the letter in both hands, her posture calm yet unyielding. "My father was younger than many of the men and women we're talking about today when he was shipped halfway across the world. He wrote this during one of the most dangerous campaigns, when his unit had been under fire for days. I want his words to be heard here, in this chamber, because they remind us what sacrifice truly means." She looked down at the page, and her voice softened, not with weakness but with reverence. "Dear family, tonight we are surrounded by sounds I never thought I'd hear in this lifetime. The jungle feels alive with fire. I don't know if I'll see the sun tomorrow, but I keep telling myself that what we're doing here is bigger than me. If I don't make it home, I need you to know that I never stopped believing America was worth it, even if she doesn't always believe in me." The words floated in the chamber, heavier than any legislation, sharper than any insult. Tuberville's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Senators who moments earlier had been scribbling notes or checking their phones now sat frozen, eyes locked on Crockett. She raised her head, her voice steady, controlled, yet tinged with the weight of memory. "My father wrote that at 21 years old. 21. He was willing to give everything for a country that, at the time, treated men who looked like him as second-class citizens. He fought anyway. He served anyway. He came home and raised a family. Anyway." The air in the chamber thickened. Crockett's delivery wasn't fiery. It didn't need to be. It was the calm clarity of truth, the kind that erases bluster and exposes arrogance for what it is. Tuberville shifted in his chair, the cameras catching the unease in his posture. His laugh, once so loud, now seemed absurd in the shadow of words written in the jungles of Vietnam. No clever comeback could compete with a soldier's last letter to home. Crockett continued, reading another line, her tone unwavering. "If I make it home, I want to live in a country that remembers us. Not just when we're needed, but when we're broken. Tell Jasmine, if she's old enough to understand someday, that her daddy never ran from a fight if it meant protecting others." Her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on, the strength of the moment carrying her forward. "This chamber has argued numbers, funding, policies. But what my father wrote was not about statistics. It was about people. It was about dignity. And when you laugh in the middle of this conversation, you are not laughing at me. You are laughing at him, At them. At every man and woman who wrote a letter like this one, hoping it wouldn't be the last thing their family ever read. Silence. A silence so profound that even the clicking of reporters' keyboards had stopped. The room seemed suspended, as though no one wanted to breathe too loudly, for fear of breaking the gravity of her words. And outside those marble walls, the world was already reacting. Clips of Crockett's reading spread across Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, igniting waves of support. Hashtags like "Ner Letter from Vietnam" and "Crockett vs. Tuberville" trended within minutes. Veterans groups shared the words of Sergeant Crockett, drawing parallels to their own service, their own letters. Families posted photographs of folded flags and framed letters kept safe for decades. Inside, Tuberville sat stiff, his eyes darting downward. Gone was the grin. Gone was the smugness. He looked less like a senator in control and more like a man caught unprepared, undone not by an opponent's sharp tongue but by the ghost of a soldier whose words carried more weight than any political punchline. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She folded the letter carefully, her hands reverent, and placed it back on the desk. Then, lifting her gaze to the chamber, she spoke with quiet force. "My father wrote that letter nearly 50 years ago. He gave his youth to this country. And today, all I ask, all any veteran's child asks, is that we honor that kind of sacrifice with respect, not ridicule. Because America is not made stronger by our laughter at one another's expense. It is made stronger by remembering that sacrifice binds us together, across race, across class, across party." No one clapped. No one cheered. The moment with celebrities joined in, amplifying the moment to audiences far beyond politics. A-list actors, musicians, and athletes reposted the video with captions like, "This is leadership," and "Silence him with truth." One pop star with 50 million followers tweeted, "Every daughter deserves to know her father's sacrifice mattered. Crockett made sure of that today." The tweet alone generated over 1 million retweets in 24 hours. Meanwhile, Tuberville's office attempted damage control. A rushed press release claimed he had merely been lightening the mood and accused the media of exaggerating. But screenshots of his laughter juxtaposed with Crockett's solemn reading made the excuse fall flat. The internet wasn't buying it. If anything, the denial only inflamed the outrage. What made the moment untouchable was its universality. It wasn't just about one senator mocking one congresswoman. It was about the chasm between service and smugness, between those who give and those who belittle. Crockett's father's words resonated because they weren't confined to one war, one family, or one time. They belonged to every family who had ever waited by the mailbox for a letter, every veteran who had ever wondered if their sacrifice was remembered. As the evening news rolled in, anchors used phrases like "a takedown," "for the ages," and "the letter that silenced the laugh." Editorials in major papers ran with headlines like, "Dignity beats derision in the Senate chamber." Overnight polls conducted online showed overwhelming approval of Crockett's handling of the exchange, even from many viewers who admitted they didn't know much about her before the clip went viral. For Tuberville, the fallout was immediate. He became a meme not for his words, but for his silence. One late-night host joked he came to laugh, but left looking like he swallowed a lemon. The audience roared, but beneath the humor was a pointed truth. He had been stripped of his power in a single moment. For Crockett, the ripple effect was different. Messages of gratitude poured in from across the country. Parents told their children about the letter. Teachers played the clip in classrooms. Churches referenced it in Sunday sermons about humility and service. For many, Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was the voice of dignity against mockery, a symbol of what it means to honor sacrifice with respect. But as the country debated the fallout, one question remained. What did this moment really mean? In the hours that followed, as the viral clip looped endlessly on every screen, the conversation began to shift. What people carried with them wasn't just the image of Tuberville silenced. It was the sound of Crockett's steady voice, carrying her father's words through the chamber like a hymn. The story had never truly been about humiliation. It was about remembrance. Crockett hadn't read that letter to score political points. She hadn't unfolded it to deliver a clever rebuttal or to embarrass an opponent on camera. She had done it for the reason her father wrote it all those years ago, to remind the living what sacrifice costs and to honor those who pay it. The moment was less a takedown and more a tribute, a reminder that dignity, when spoken aloud, can still pierce through arrogance like a sunlight-breaking cloud. Across the country, families recognized themselves in that moment. The widow who kept her husband's dog tags tucked away in a box, the son who still carried his father's photo from the Gulf War in his wallet, the mother who kissed her daughter goodbye before deployment, never knowing if another letter would come home. Crockett's father's words became their words too. They reminded America that service is not abstract. It is lived. It is bled. It is written in letters that outlast generations, and with that recognition came a truth bigger than one senator's arrogance or one congresswoman's poise. Dignity endures. Laughter fades, arrogance crumbles, mockery shrinks to nothing. But dignity, the kind forged in sacrifice and spoken with sincerity, lasts. It outlasts the noise of politics, the vanity of headlines, the smirks of those who mistake cruelty for strength. Crockett's delivery transformed the debate from a clash of egos into a meditation on what America aspires to be. Her father's voice, reaching from a battlefield half a century ago, reminded the chamber that the nation's greatness is measured not in laughter or derision, but in courage, justice, and the simple act of remembering. For those watching, the lesson felt universal. It was not about left or right, not about winning a news cycle or trending on Twitter. It was about the soul of the country, the idea that respect is not optional, that honor is not negotiable, that mocking sacrifice is never strength but always weakness. In that chamber, Crockett held her ground not by shouting but by remembering. And in doing so, she showed that memory itself is power. Power to silence arrogance, power to inspire reverence, power to remind a divided nation of its shared humanity. When Tuberville laughed, he thought he was minimizing. But what Crockett revealed was that some legacies cannot be minimized. Some sacrifices cannot be erased. Some words, written decades ago under the weight of war, still rise above the noise of politics and demand to be heard. And for millions watching, the lesson was clear. Some letters speak louder than laughter. He laughed. That was how it started. An arrogant chuckle echoing through the chamber, meant to belittle, meant to dismiss. But what silenced him wasn't anger, wasn't outrage, wasn't even politics. It was a letter. A simple, fragile letter carried, for decades, written by a young soldier in Vietnam who believed his words might outlast his body. And in the end, they did. Tuberville's smirk vanished, but Crockett's father's voice remains. That is the truth of this moment. Arrogance fades, but honor echoes. Mockery dissolves, but service endures. For every family who has ever folded a flag, for every veteran who has ever struggled to explain what sacrifice feels like, this moment was not just political theater, it was testimony. Crockett showed us that dignity is not weakness, that memory is not passive, that words written in courage can still silence cruelty decades later. And now, the story is yours. If this moment moved you, share it. If it reminded you of your father, your sister, your friend, your own service, carry it forward. Because the louder we tell these stories, the quieter arrogance becomes. This channel exists to shine light on those clashes where dignity meets derision, where truth outlasts mockery. So, if you believe in amplifying voices like Jasmine Crockett's, If you want these stories to keep traveling beyond the chamber, join us. Subscribe. Share. Be part of the movement that insists respect is greater than ridicule, and that some letters, no matter how old, no matter how fragile, can still speak louder than laughter.